Tonight, our story drifts across centuries, moving slowly, gently, through the vast expanse of Russia's history. A land of forest and rivers, of snow and fire, of empires and villages, where myth and memory still walk side by side. Breathe slowly, as if each breath carries you further back in time. Until the present fades and only the past remains, shimmering like starlight reflected on water. Before Russia, before cities and crowns, before the empire of Tsars or the banners of revolution, there were the endless spaces of the land itself. Imagine the great forests of birch stretching without end, rivers like silver serpents winding toward distant seas, and wide steppes where the grass sways like an ocean beneath the wind. This was a land of beginnings, where tribes moved quietly across the soil, following rivers, hunting, fishing, and telling stories by the glow of fires. The early Slavs' ancestors of those who would one day call themselves Russian lived close to the rhythm of nature. They honored spirits of forest and water, believed thunder was the voice of Perun, the storm god, and left offerings for the quiet, hidden beings said to dwell in the trees. Their world was not yet divided by borders or laws. It was shaped instead by myths, by seasons, and by the slow pulse of the earth. As centuries passed, the land drew the footsteps of many peoples. From the north came Norse traders and warriors, the Varangians, steering their long ships down rivers that glittered under the sun. From the east and south came nomads on horseback, swift as shadows across the steppe. The land that would become Russia was never still. It was a meeting place of cultures, a crossroads where languages mingled and faiths intertwined. In the silence of night, when the stars pressed close above the forests, one could almost imagine the ancestors listening to the whisper of the rivers, waiting for destiny to unfold. The legends tell us of Rurik, a Varangian prince invited by the Slavs to bring order and rule. Around the year 862, he established his rule in Novgorod, in the north, near cold lakes and wooden fortresses. Whether myth or truth, his story marks the beginning of a dynasty that would shape the land for centuries. From Rurik's line came rulers who built alliances, gathered tribute, and extended their influence along the great water routes. Imagine merchants on the Volkhov River, their boats heavy with furs, honey, wax, and silver, their voices carrying in many tongues as they traveled toward Byzantium and the rich lands of the south. The rivers were lifelines, highways of trade and culture, linking the Slavic tribes not only to their neighbors, but to the great empires beyond. As power shifted southward, a new center emerged along the Dnieper River, Kiev. There, under skies wide and clear, grew the foundations of what we now call Kievan Rus. It was not yet Russia, not yet a single nation, but a loose gathering of principalities bound by kinship, trade, and faith. Kiev became a glittering hub of commerce, where Byzantine icons mingled with Slavic wood carvings, where Greek priests taught new prayers while pagan songs still echoed in the forests beyond the city walls. The early Rus lived in both worlds, balancing old beliefs with the new. And in that balance, something unique began to form. A cultural seed that would one day grow into Russia. But before the conversion, before the domes of golden churches, the people still honored their ancient gods. In the forests, rituals were held at sacred groves, where oaks whispered secrets in the wind. Fires were lit on high hills to call forth the favor of Perun, while offerings of bread and mead were left at riverbanks for Velas, the god of cattle and wealth, who was said to dwell beneath the waters. Life was a circle of harvests, winters, and rituals, each season tied to faith and survival. Yet, the rivers carried more than goods and stories. They carried ideas. And soon, the tide of faith flowing from Byzantium would reshape the land forever. Close your eyes and picture Kiev at the dawn of its greatness. Wooden fortresses rising against the horizon. Markets alive with voices and colors, and messengers bringing news of distant lands. It was here that Prince Vladimir, known as Vladimir the Great, made a choice that would echo through 1,000 years. In 988, he embraced Christianity, not the Latin Christianity of Rome, but the Orthodox faith of Byzantium. With baptism came a flood of change, new alphabet, new art, new laws, and a spiritual identity that bound the Rus more closely together. Churches rose, their domes painted in gold that caught the morning light like suns. The chanting of liturgy echoed through stone walls, mixing with the smoke of incense, weaving a new layer of sacredness into the land. This moment was more than religion. It was a transformation of culture. Pagan traditions did not vanish overnight. They lingered, woven into songs, festivals, and customs. The people still leaped over midsummer fires, still whispered to spirits of the fields, even as they crossed themselves before icons. Russia, even in its earliest form, was a place of blending, of contradictions held together, of light and shadow intertwined. And from this blend arose a resilience, a sense of survival that would carry the people through centuries of invasion and hardship yet to come. As you drift deeper into the story, imagine the candlelight of a Kievan church flickering across painted icons, illuminating faces of saints in silence. Imagine also the bonfire beyond the city, where villagers dance in circles beneath the stars, singing songs older than memory. This is the soul of the beginnings, both sacred and wild, rooted in soil and sky. It is here that Russia's long and winding story truly begins. Not as an empire, but as a gathering of people bound by river and faith, by myth and memory, waiting for the tides of history to carry them forward. The city of Kiev, rising by the broad Dnieper River, became more than a trading post. It grew into the beating heart of a realm. Imagine its wooden ramparts, tall and sturdy, encircling a city alive with markets and bells, merchants and monks, soldiers and artisans. The scent of honey and smoke fills the air, mingling with the voices of traders from distant lands. Here was a place where East met West, where goods from Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the steppe all flowed toward the glittering empire of Byzantium. The Rus carried furs, wax, and slaves down the river routes, and in return came silks, wine, icons, and knowledge. This river road to Byzantium became a lifeline, and Kiev flourished in its glow. The reign of Vladimir the Great marked the turning of an age, but it was under his son, Yaroslav the Wise, that Kiev shone brightest. Imagine walking through its streets in the 11th century. At the center, the magnificent church of Saint Sophia rising with its multiple domes. Inside, adorned with mosaics of golden saints shimmering in lamplight. Around it stretched schools, libraries, and courts of law. Yaroslav brought codification to the realm, compiling the Russkaya Pravda, the Justice of Rus, the first written law code of the people. Simple compared to the laws of Byzantium, yet profound in its meaning. An attempt to bind a vast and varied land through common justice. In Kiev's markets, one would have seen a mixture of faces: Slavic farmers with their grain, and flax Norsemen with axes at their belts, steppe nomads leading horses, Greek artisans selling icons and jewelry. The streets hummed with diversity. Foreign envoys brought treaties and alliances, and marriages were arranged across Europe. Yaroslav's daughters married into royal families of France, Hungary, and Norway, weaving the Rus into the web of European dynasties. This land, often remembered as isolated, was in truth connected, its rivers serving as threads, stitching it into the fabric of the wider world. The Orthodox faith brought more than religion, it brought literacy. Monks carefully copied manuscripts by hand, using the Cyrillic script developed by Saints Cyril and Methodius, which gave the Slavic people's letters shaped to their own tongue. Within dimly lit monasteries, candlelight flickered on parchment as scribes bent over their work, filling pages with psalms, chronicles, and prayers. This quiet work, done with patience and devotion, preserved history even as wars and fires raged outside the walls. The monastery bells tolled across the valleys, a sound both earthly and eternal, anchoring communities through faith and memory. Kievan Rus was not a single kingdom, but a federation of principalities, each ruled by princes of the Rurikid dynasty. At its height, the lands stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, tied together by river routes, trade, and shared faith. Yet beneath the glitter of Kiev's domes lay tension. Rival princes competed for succession, and the unity that made Rus strong was fragile. Still, in this golden age, the land produced not only wealth and monuments, but a distinct culture. Wooden churches rose with sloping roofs designed to shed snow. The great epics, or bailani, were sung by wandering bards, recounting tales of heroes like Ilya Muromets, a peasant blessed with strength who defended the land against enemies and monsters. In these stories, one hears both myth and memory, the spirit of a people shaping its identity. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, lived lives bound to the soil. Imagine their villages of wooden huts, smoke curling from chimneys, chickens scratching in the dust, children playing at the edge of fields. Life was harsh, but community and ritual gave it rhythm. The seasons guided everything. Planting in spring, harvest in autumn, the long endurance of winter. Festivals broke the monotony. Feasts with bread and mead, dances in circles, songs echoing into the night. Though distant from the splendor of Kiev, these villages formed the true backbone of Rus, carrying traditions that would survive long after dynasties rose and fell. Conflict was never far. Steppe. Nomads raided from the south, swift on horseback, burning and plundering. Kiev had to defend its borders constantly, building fortresses and sending out armies. Yet even these clashes shaped the culture. Tales of raids and battles entered the songs, giving voice to both fear and resilience. The people lived with a sense of both vulnerability and endurance, knowing that life could change in an instant, yet also trusting in faith, family, and land. By the 12th century, cracks widened. Kiev's dominance weakened as rival centers of power grew stronger. Novgorod in the north, with its Vech or popular assembly, became a republic of merchants and boyars. Vladimir Suzdal rose in the northeast, drawing strength from fertile soil and strategic rivers. The unity of Rus began to fragment, and princes fought each other as much as they defended against outsiders. Kiev still held prestige as the cradle of faith and culture, but its grip loosened and shadows gathered on the horizon. Even in its decline, Kiev's glow did not vanish. Chronicles continued to be written, telling of saints and battles, floods and eclipses. The primary chronicle, compiled by monks, told not only of rulers but of myths, miracles, and the very origins of the people. Reading it today feels like hearing a voice carried through smoke and centuries, a mixture of truth and legend meant not just to record, but to inspire. The chroniclers believed they were inscribing not only the past, but the will of God upon parchment, each word echoing into eternity. As you let this scene linger, picture Kiev at twilight, the domes of Saint Sophia catching the last rays of sun. Streets filled with merchants closing their stalls, the sound of bells rolling over the river. In the countryside, peasants gather by firelight, singing ancient songs as wolves howl faintly in the distance. The land feels both vast and intimate, fragile, yet eternal. This was the golden age of Kievan Rus, a light that shone bright, but soon storms would descend. Riders from the east, fierce and relentless, would sweep across the plains, and the old order would shatter. Yet the memory of Kiev, its faith, its stories, its resilience, would never be forgotten, carried forward through darkness into the centuries to come. The 12th century closed with shadows gathering over the land. The unity of Kievan Rus had already begun to splinter, and rival principalities stood fragile against the storms that would soon arrive from beyond the horizon. From the east came whispers of riders, swift as the wind. An unstoppable tide of horsemen, led by a name that struck fear wherever it spread. Genghis Khan and the Mongols. By the time the Rus heard of their coming, cities in Central Asia and Persia had already burned, and kingdoms had fallen silent under their hooves. In the vast silence of the steppe, one could almost feel the ground trembling before the storm. In 1223, at the Kalka River, the Rus princes gathered their forces to meet the Mongols. Imagine the wide fields, the banners raised, the sound of hooves drumming like thunder. The Mongols, though fewer in number, fought with a cunning unfamiliar to the Rus. They feigned retreat, drawing the Rus into pursuit, then turned and crushed them with arrows and steel. The battle ended in disaster. Thousands were slain, and princes were captured, executed beneath planks as Mongol feasts were laid upon them. A grim symbol of domination. Yet this was only a prelude, a warning of the storm to come. The Mongols withdrew for a time, leaving fear to fester across the land. 2 decades later, the storm returned in full. In 1237, the armies of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, swept into Rus with fire and iron. Town after town fell. Ryazan was the first, its wooden walls consumed by flame, its people cut down or carried into slavery. Then came Vladimir, once a rising center of power, its churches collapsing under siege, its bells silenced. Finally, in 1240, Kiev itself was besieged. The mother of Rus, the great city by the Dnieper, was battered until its walls crumbled. Fires devoured its churches, and its people were scattered. Chroniclers wrote of streets filled with bodies of silence where once bells had rung. The golden age of Kiev was over. Rus lay broken, its princes humbled, its land bowed beneath a new master. This new dominion became known as the Tatar yoke, the rule of the Mongols and their successors. The Golden Horde, from their capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga, they demanded tribute from the Rus princes. Each year, caravans of silver, furs, and goods were sent to appease the Khans. The Rus rulers were forced to kneel to receive their right to rule from Mongol hands, and to ride to Sarai when summoned. For over 2 centuries, the Mongols held sway. Their horsemen could appear suddenly on the steppe, burning villages that resisted. Fear was constant, and submission seemed the only path to survival. Yet beneath this heavy yoke, something unexpected happened. The Orthodox Church, spared from destruction by Mongol pragmatism, became the heart of cultural survival. In monasteries, far from battlefields, monks continued to write, to paint icons, to ring their bells. Pilgrims still journeyed to shrines, and the liturgy echoed across valleys, carrying a sense of continuity through centuries of darkness. In their faith, the people found strength. The Mongols cared little for religion, so long as tribute was paid. And so, the church became a sanctuary for identity, preserving the flame of Rus in silence and prayer. The Mongols themselves left their mark. They brought new systems of taxation, census taking, and administration. They built roads across the steppes, linking east and west, opening routes of trade that connected Rus to China, Persia, and beyond. Through their rule, ideas and goods traveled, papermaking, coinage, even military techniques. It was a rule of fear, yet it was also a bridge to the wider world. The Rus, though bent, absorbed these influences, shaping them into their own patterns. Even in oppression, adaptation stirred quietly, preparing for renewal. The center of gravity shifted northward, With Kiev destroyed, new cities began to rise in importance. Novgorod, with its merchant republic, preserved independence by skillful diplomacy, sending tribute but keeping autonomy. Vladimir, though wounded, remained a seat of culture and power. And most quietly of all, Moscow began to rise. At first, a small outpost on the Moskva River, it grew steadily under Mongol oversight, its princes proving skilled at both loyalty and cunning. By collecting tribute for the Horde, Moscow enriched itself, gaining favor and advantage over rivals. From the shadows of Mongol rule, a future center of resistance was slowly taking shape. The Mongol invasion left scars not only on cities, but on memory. The chronicles describe it with grief and awe, as if the people could scarcely believe the devastation. Villages erased, churches turned to ash, bells melted, libraries lost. And yet, the stories also tell of survival. Peasants fleeing into forests, hidden monasteries preserving relics, quiet endurance beneath the yoke. The very vastness of the land, its forests and snows, gave shelter. The Mongols could dominate the cities and the open steppe, but in the endless woods, life continued, guarded by silence and resilience. Picture now the Rus countryside in the 13th century, snow falling on wooden huts, smoke rising from chimneys. Families gathered around a hearth, whispering prayers, knowing that beyond the forest, horsemen could appear at any moment. The bells of a distant monastery toll, steady against the fear. In the city of Sarai, Mongol nobles feast, their tents glittering with silk, their tables heavy with goods brought as tribute. And in Moscow, a quiet prince counts silver, waiting for the day when fortune might shift. Between these scenes stretches a land bowed yet unbroken, waiting in patience for renewal. The Mongol rule, for all its cruelty, did not erase the Rus identity. Instead, it tempered it like iron in a furnace. The people learned endurance, the church became a beacon, and Moscow began its ascent. The centuries of darkness would not last forever. On the horizon lay battles where Rus would rise against the Horde, where banners of saints would be lifted against the horsemen of the steppe. In the silence of the monasteries, in the patience of the peasants, and in the ambition of Moscow's princes, the seed of liberation was already growing, ready to one day burst forth and change the course of history. From the ashes of Kiev and the long shadow of Mongol rule, a new center of strength began to stir. Moscow, once only a modest settlement by the Moskva River, grew quietly at first, unnoticed beside the grander cities of Novgorod and Vladimir. But its location was a gift, surrounded by rivers that offered trade, and protection deep within forests that shielded it from sudden raids. It was a fortress hidden in the land's embrace. And within its walls, a dynasty of ambitious princes slowly shaped destiny with patience and calculation. In the 14th century, Moscow's princes became adept at surviving beneath the Golden Horde's gaze. They collected tribute not only for themselves, but for the Khans, positioning themselves as reliable allies. This role gave them privilege, wealth, and a cloak of legitimacy in the eyes of the Mongol rulers. Ivan I, known as Ivan Kalita, Ivan Moneybag, was the most skillful of them all. He secured from the Horde the right to gather tribute across the northeastern lands, funneling silver into Moscow's coffers. With this wealth, he purchased lands, built churches, and fortified his city. Slowly, Moscow grew not just in power, but in sanctity. For Ivan also invited the Orthodox Metropolitan, the spiritual leader of Rus, to move his seat from Vladimir to Moscow. With that move, Moscow became not only a political center, but a holy one. The guardian of the faith, during a time when faith was the people's lifeline. Picture Moscow in Ivan Kalita's day. Wooden walls rising on a hill by the river. Within them, markets bustling with grain and fur. Smiths hammering iron, and priests in dark robes carrying icons through the streets. Bells ring from churches as smoke curls into the sky. Beyond the city, endless forests whisper with wind and snow. It was not yet a grand capital, but already its aura was different. A place where power and holiness walked side by side. As decades passed, Moscow's princes grew bolder. They forged alliances through marriage, claimed neighboring lands through purchase or force, and positioned themselves as defenders of orthodoxy against outsiders. When raiders struck, Moscow rallied men to protect the faith. Each victory, each treaty, each church built upon the Kremlin hill strengthened its claim as the heart of Rus. The Mongols loomed, demanding tribute, reminding the princes of their subservience. The first great test came in the reign of Dmitry Ivanovich, remembered as Dmitry Donskoy. In 1380, he led a coalition of Rus princes against the Mongol general Mamai at the Battle of Kulikovo. Imagine the dawn of that September day, mist rising over the fields, banners painted with saints' faces fluttering in the breeze. The armies forming lines across the wide plain. At the center, Dmitry prayed before the icon of Saint Sergius, a holy man whose blessing had promised strength. Then the clash began. Arrows darkened the sky. Swords clashed. The ground trembled with the charge of horsemen. For hours the battle raged, until finally the Rus forces overwhelmed their foes. Mamai's army was broken, and for the first time the people felt the weight of the yoke lift, if only for a moment. Though the Mongols soon returned, though tribute was demanded once more, Kulikovo was a turning point. It planted in the hearts of the people a belief that freedom was possible, that the Horde could be challenged. In the silence of monasteries, monks wrote of Kulikovo with reverence, not only as a military victory, but as a sacred triumph. They told how Saint Sergius had sent 2 warrior monks into battle, how angels were seen above the field, how God had granted favor to the Rus. Whether legend or truth, the memory of Kulikovo became a beacon, a story whispered in villages, sung in epics, recited in chronicles. It was proof that endurance could become defiance, that patience could blossom into courage. Moscow's strength was not built only on war. Its princes understood the power of faith and symbol. Churches rose with onion-shaped domes, painted with gold that caught the sun even in the bleakness of winter. Icons of saints glowed with candlelight, filling the air with a sense of presence and protection. The people saw Moscow not only as a fortress, but as a sanctuary, a place chosen to guard orthodoxy in a dangerous world. As pilgrims journeyed to its shrines, as markets swelled with trade, the city grew in both body and soul. By the 15th century, the Mongol grip weakened. The Horde fractured into rival khanates, their power diminished by internal strife. The Rus princes sensed the change. In 1480, under Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, Moscow refused to pay tribute. At the Ugra River, the armies of Moscow and the Horde faced each other across the water. Tension hung heavy. Days passed, but no battle came. At last, the Mongols withdrew. Without a clash of swords, without rivers of blood, the yoke was lifted. The people called it the Great Stand on the Ugra, and it marked the end of 2 centuries of domination. Moscow stood free, and with freedom came ambition. Ivan the Great declared himself sovereign of all Rus, a Tsar in all but name, and envisioned his city as the heir of Byzantium, the Third Rome, destined to carry the torch of orthodoxy. After Constantinople's fall to the Turks, the Kremlin, once wooden, was rebuilt in stone with the help of Italian architects. Towers and cathedrals rose, their white walls and golden domes gleaming above the river. Within, courts of justice and halls of ceremony gave shape to a new authority. The idea of Russia, of a single realm united under one ruler, began to take form. The chronicles spoke of Moscow with awe, as if destiny itself had chosen it from among the scattered cities of Rus. The small outpost by the river had become the center of a rising state, a place where patience and faith had turned subservience into sovereignty. As you linger in this moment, imagine Moscow at twilight in the time of Ivan the Great, the Kremlin towers glowing against the sky, bells tolling in deep, resonant waves, merchants crossing the bridges with carts of grain, monks chanting in candlelit chambers, and in the distance, peasants trudging home through snow with firewood on their shoulders. It is a city both humble and holy, both fragile and eternal, carrying within it the quiet heartbeat of a people who had endured fire and darkness, and who now stood ready to shape an empire. When Ivan III stood upon the Kremlin walls and declared Moscow sovereign, he planted the seed of a new age. No longer merely princes of scattered lands, the rulers of Moscow began to claim the mantle of Tsars, heirs not only to the Rus, but to Byzantium itself. Ivan III, remembered as Ivan the Great, married Sophia Polyologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and with her came a legacy of imperial authority. The double-headed eagle, once the symbol of Constantinople, now adorned Moscow's banners, its 2 faces looking east and west. In this union of blood and symbol, Moscow proclaimed itself the Third Rome, the last defender of the Orthodox faith, destined to stand eternal as Rome and Byzantium had fallen. The idea was powerful, and it gave to Moscow a vision greater than mere survival. It was now to be an empire. Ivan the Great expanded Moscow's dominion, annexing Novgorod in 1478, bringing the great merchant republic under his control. Novgorod, with its vetch, its traditions of communal decision, its ties to the Hanseatic League, had long been a city apart, a place of northern independence, its markets filled with foreign goods, its churches adorned with frescoes. But when Ivan's armies marched and the bells of Novgorod were carried to Moscow, its independence ended. The vetch was silenced, its voice absorbed into the growing unity of Muscovy. It was a moment both triumphant and mournful, the dream of republican freedom extinguished. Yet the dream of Russian unity strengthened. Piece by piece, Moscow gathered the fragments of Rus into one. The city itself grew into a vision of power. Italian architects invited to Moscow rebuilt the Kremlin in stone, its towers crowned with red brick and white crenellations, its cathedrals gleaming with golden domes. The Cathedral of the Assumption, designed by Aristotle Fioravante, became the seat of coronations. Its vast interior filled with the scent of incense and the light of oil lamps flickering on icons. Here, in ceremony and ritual, Moscow declared its sacred mission. The Kremlin became more than a fortress. It was a symbol of eternity, a citadel of faith and empire rising above the Moskva River. Yet the true transformation came with Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, he was crowned in 1547 as the first ruler to bear the title of Tsar, a word echoing from Caesar, linking Moscow to Rome's imperial grandeur. His reign was one of contradictions, a tale of brilliance and cruelty, of vision and terror. In his youth, Ivan was learned, eloquent, and deeply religious. He reformed law, strengthened central authority, and summoned the Zemsky Sobor, the first national assembly of the land. He reorganized the military, establishing the Streltsy, the musket-bearing guards who stood as a new power in warfare. His armies pushed eastward, conquering Kazan in 1552, opening the gates of the Volga to Moscow's authority. The fall of Kazan was celebrated with the building of St. Basil's Cathedral, its onion domes rising like flames, painted in colors of fire and sky, a vision of heaven upon Red Square. To this day, its domes gleam like dream shapes, born of conquest and faith. But Ivan's brilliance darkened into shadow. Racked by suspicion, haunted by betrayal, he unleashed the Oprynaina, a reign of terror marked by black-robed horsemen who rode under the symbol of broom and dog's head, to sweep away treachery, to devour traitors. Towns were sacked, boyars slaughtered, whole communities destroyed. Novgorod, suspected of disloyalty, was devastated, its people drowned in icy rivers, its churches plundered. The memory of these horrors lingered like scars, whispered of in chronicles with sorrow and dread. Ivan, once a visionary, became a figure of fear, a czar whose wrath seemed boundless, whose power had turned inward against his own land. And yet, even in these dark years, Russia expanded. Beyond Kazan and Astrakhan, the frontier pushed into Siberia, vast and untamed. Cossacks, free warriors and adventurers of the steppe, carried Moscow's banners across the Ural Mountains into forests and rivers unknown to European maps. Yermak Timofeyevich, the legendary Cossack leader, led expeditions that opened Siberia to Russian dominion. Crossing rivers so wide they seemed endless, battling tribes who resisted, planting the cross in distant lands. The conquest of Siberia was less a single campaign than a tide, slow and relentless, carried forward by trade in furs, by hunger for land, by the restless spirit of frontier life. It was a vision of expansion that would one day stretch to the Pacific. But in Ivan's time, it was the first glimmer of Russia as a vast empire. Culturally, the age was marked by faith and artistry. Churches multiplied, their icons painted with luminous faces that seemed to glow with otherworldly fire. The tradition of icon painting, carried forward by masters like Andrei Rublev in earlier times, now flourished as monasteries filled with works meant to bring heaven close to earth. Manuscripts were copied, chronicles expanded, hymns composed. In the midst of war and terror, a spiritual flowering persisted, as if faith itself offered balance to the Tsar's iron hand. The people endured as they always had, weaving survival into ritual, hardship into prayer. Ivan's personal life mirrored his contradictions. He was a man of deep piety, yet of sudden violence. In 1581, in a fit of rage, he struck his own son, the Tsarevich, killing him. The tragedy left the dynasty weakened, the Tsar haunted. When Ivan died in 1584, he left behind not only an empire larger than ever before, but a land scarred by fear, suspicion, and instability. His reign was both a foundation and a fracture, a chapter of grandeur and cruelty, of vision and ruin, woven into the soul of Russia. As you linger here, imagine Moscow in Ivan's time, Red Square alive with merchants, the spires of St. Basil's glowing in the evening sun, the Kremlin towers casting long shadows, bells tolling with somber power. Beyond the walls, peasants till fields, Cossacks ride eastward, and in dark chambers, whispers of treachery echo under the Tsar's gaze. It is an age both luminous and terrifying, where faith soars to heaven even as fear roots itself deep in the earth. This is the Tsardom of Russia, a realm no longer bowed to outsiders, but torn within, both majestic and haunted, poised on the threshold of centuries yet to come. When Ivan the Terrible's reign ended in 1584, the land he left behind was vast, but fragile, strong, yet fractured. His chosen heir, Fyodor I, was gentle, deeply pious, and lacking the will to govern. He spent his days in prayer, ringing church bells himself, a czar more like a monk than a ruler. With Fyodor's weakness, power drifted into the hands of his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, a man of talent and ambition. For a time, Boris steered the realm wisely, strengthening defenses, encouraging learning, and seeking peace. Yet, destiny is rarely kind for long, and in the shadows, storms gathered. The end of the 16th century brought not triumph, but hunger. From 1601 to 1603, harvests failed, and famine spread across the land. Imagine the silence of empty fields, the sound of bells tolling for the dead in village after village. Chronicles speak of desperate people eating bark, moss, even the flesh of horses long perished. Corpses lined the roads, and whole communities vanished. More than a third of the population perished in those years. A wound so deep it seemed the land itself wept. The famine weakened faith in Boris Godunov's rule, and in the emptiness of authority, pretenders arose. The most famous of these was the false Dmitri, a man claiming to be the miraculously saved son of Ivan the Terrible, thought dead for years. He gathered support from Polish nobles, from Cossacks, from peasants eager for change, and marched into Russia. Boris died suddenly in 1605, perhaps poisoned, perhaps crushed by fate. The pretender entered Moscow in triumph, seated himself upon the throne, and, for a brief moment, it seemed the dynasty of Rurik had returned. But his reign was short. His foreign supporters angered the Boyars. His ways seemed strange, and in 1606 he was killed. His body burned, his ashes fired from a cannon. Yet his death did not end the chaos, it deepened it. More pretenders rose, each claiming the title of Dmitri, each gathering armies, each tearing the land further into disarray. This was the time of troubles, years when Russia seemed to unravel. Civil war raged, famine lingered, foreign armies invaded. From the west came the Poles, seizing Moscow itself in 1610, their banners flying over the Kremlin. From the south, Crimean Tatars raided. The Boyars schemed. Peasants rebelled. Cossacks rose in fury. In the villages, people whispered that the end of days had come, that Russia itself might disappear. Monasteries became fortresses, holding out against siege with prayer and sword. The Holy Trinity Laver of St. Sergius, north of Moscow, withstood 16 months of Polish attack, its monks and peasants fighting side by side, their bells ringing defiantly over the smoke of battle. And yet, in the very depths of chaos, unity stirred. In 1612, a movement rose not from princes, but from the people. A merchant of Nizhny Novgorod, Kuzma Mini, called upon his city to gather an army. Beside him stood Prince Dmitri Pozarsky, a noble of honor and courage. Together, they led a force of volunteers, peasants, merchants, Cossacks, nobles, bound not by dynastic loyalty, but by love of land and faith. They marched to Moscow, and after fierce fighting, they expelled the Polish garrison. The Kremlin bells rang again for freedom. That moment when common people and nobles stood together to reclaim their land became one of Russia's most cherished memories, honored to this day with monuments in Red Square. Yet, victory alone was not enough. The throne stood empty. In 1613, an assembly was called, the Zemsky Sober, bringing together nobles, clergy, merchants, and townsmen. Their choice was Mikhail Romanov, a boy only 16, the son of a respected but exiled patriarchal family. He was young, untainted by the rivalries of the past, and his name promised peace. When the envoys came to tell him he had been chosen, legend says his mother wept, fearing the weight of the crown. But Mikhail accepted. His election marked the end of the time of troubles and the beginning of a new dynasty. The Romanovs, who would rule Russia for more than 300 years. The early Romanovs faced a land shattered by war and famine. Villages lay in ruins, fields untended, churches burned. Rebuilding was slow, but under Mikhail and his successors, stability returned. The borders were secured, foreign armies driven back, and the old rhythms of life began to heal. Taxes were reformed, trade revived, and new settlements spread eastward into Siberia. It was a time of gathering strength, of slow recovery, of endurance turned into quiet progress. Picture Russia in the mid-17th century. Wooden villages rebuilt along riverbanks. Smoke curling from chimneys once more. Children laughing in fields of rye. In Moscow, the Kremlin bells toll in steady rhythm. The markets fill with goods, and new churches rise with painted domes. The Romanovs, though cautious, present themselves as protectors of orthodoxy. Their courts filled with ceremony, their authority sanctified by faith. It is not yet an empire of brilliance, not yet the power of Peter or Catherine, but it is steady, a land healed from chaos, a people reminded that even in the darkest winters, spring can return. The time of troubles had tested Russia as never before. It had faced famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and betrayal from within. And yet, from that crucible, a stronger identity emerged. Russia as a land bound not only by rulers, but by faith, by community, by endurance. The Romanovs, young and untested, inherited a throne, fragile, yet filled with potential. In the centuries to come, they would guide Russia through transformation after transformation, until the small realm left by Ivan IV would become a mighty empire stretching across continents. For now, as twilight settles on this age, imagine the quiet relief of the people, the famine receding, the wars ending, the land slowly mending its wounds. Fires burn again in hearths. Bells ring in villages. Prayers rise in churches. Out of chaos, order returns, and from despair, hope is reborn. The Romanovs stand at the threshold of history, and Russia, scarred but alive, prepares to enter an age of expansion, reform, and glory. When the Romanovs secured the throne, their first task was survival. Mikhail Romanov, crowned in 1613, ruled cautiously, restoring order where chaos had reigned. His successors, Alexis and Fyodor, continued to rebuild. Moscow grew strong again, its churches multiplying, its markets swelling, its walls repaired. Yet by the late 17th century, Russia remained a land of contrasts, vast and rich in resources, but old in its ways. Its peasants bound by serfdom, its armies clumsy before modern foes, its cities wooden against the stone capitals of Europe. The world beyond Russia's forests, moved swiftly, shaped by science, commerce, and new ideas. And soon, a ruler would rise who refused to let his country remain behind. Peter, the son of Tsar Alexis, was unlike any ruler before him. Tall, towering above most men, restless, curious, with a fierce temper and a boundless energy. Peter the Great believed that Russia must transform itself or remain forever weak. From the moment he seized power in 1689, his life became a whirlwind of reform. He traveled secretly to Europe, working in shipyards of Holland, learning the craft of navigation. When he returned, he brought not only knowledge, but a vision. Russia must have a navy, a modern army, new schools, new cities, new ways of life. The old ways were no longer enough. Imagine Moscow in Peter's early years. Bojars with long beards and robes, monasteries filled with chants, peasants tied to the soil. Then picture Peter's decrees. Nobles ordered to shave their beards, to dress in European coats, to send their sons abroad to study. A window was to be cut into Europe, and from that window, light would pour. Resistance was fierce, but Peter's will was stronger. He built schools for mathematics and navigation, founded new industries, reorganized government, and demanded discipline from soldiers and nobles alike. The land groaned beneath the weight of change, yet step by step, it began to move in rhythm with his vision. The symbol of his dream was a new city. In 1703, on the marshy banks of the Neva River, Peter laid the foundations of St. Petersburg. It rose from swamps through the labor of thousands, built with stone, while Moscow still stood largely in wood. Palaces in European style lined broad avenues, canals were dug, bridges spanned waterways, and the Peter and Paul fortress guarded the heart of the city. Peter moved his capital there, calling it his window to the west. To walk through St. Petersburg was to feel both awe and exhaustion. Awe at its grandeur, exhaustion at the suffering of the peasants who built it with their lives. Yet the city endured, shimmering in stone and water, a new face of Russia gazing toward Europe. Militarily, Peter's reign was marked by war. The Great Northern War against Sweden raged for 2 decades, testing his reforms. At Poltava in 1709, his modernized army defeated Charles XII of Sweden, a victory that declared to Europe that Russia had risen. From that point on, no power could ignore it. Russia gained access to the Baltic, its navy sailed new waters, and its voice entered the councils of Europe. For the first time, Russia was an empire recognized among empires, and Peter its tireless architect. But transformation carried cost. Serfdom deepened as nobles gained power over peasants in return for service to the state. Taxes multiplied, labor was demanded, and the common people bore the burden of reform. In villages, life remained harsh, bound to land and lord. Yet even there, the reach of Peter's vision could be felt. New tools, new demands, new rhythms pressed upon ancient traditions. Faith still guided daily life. Bells still rang from monasteries, but the winds of change whispered even into quiet fields. After Peter's death in 1725, The empire he built wavered under rulers less strong, yet his foundation endured. Decades later, another towering figure would take the throne, shaping Russia once again. Catherine II, remembered as Catherine the Great, a German princess by birth. She became empress in 1762 after the deposition of her husband, Peter III. Intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, Catherine embraced the Enlightenment while ruling with firm authority. She corresponded with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, filled her libraries with their works, and sought to present Russia as a land not of backwardness, but of reason and progress. Under Catherine, the empire expanded further still. Russian armies defeated the Ottomans, claiming new lands on the Black Sea. Crimea was annexed, opening warm water ports long coveted. To the west, partitions of Poland brought vast new territories under Russian rule. To the east, Siberia continued to beckon, its forests and rivers drawing settlers and traders deeper into Asia. By the end of a reign, Russia stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Black Sea, an empire of almost unimaginable size, diverse in its peoples and landscapes. Catherine's court glittered with art, music, and philosophy. Palaces rose in St. Petersburg, adorned with gilded halls, paintings, and sculpture. The Hermitage Museum began with her collection, a treasury of Europe's finest works. She sought to codify laws, to improve education, to nurture culture. Yet beneath the brilliance, contradictions remained. Serfdom grew harsher, binding millions in poverty, while nobles reveled in luxury. Rebellions flared. Most famously, the Pugachev uprising in the 1770s, when a Cossack leader claimed to be the true Tsar and led tens of thousands in revolt. Villages burned, armies clashed, and the rebellion was crushed with brutal force. It was a reminder that beneath the grandeur of palaces, the soil of Russia was restless, its people yearning for freedom long denied. Still, Catherine's reign marked a high point of imperial power. Russia was no longer a hidden land of forests and steppes, but a central force in European politics. Its voice shaping treaties, its armies feared, its culture admired. Yet the contradictions, reform and repression, enlightenment and serfdom, lingered like shadows, waiting for future generations to resolve. Beyond court and empire, daily life carried on. In villages, peasants still gathered by the hearth, sang folk songs, celebrated holy days with bread and mead, and tilled the soil season after season. In towns, merchants sold furs, cloth, and tea, the latter becoming a beloved ritual, with samovars steaming in homes, rich and poor. Wooden churches with painted icons stood at crossroads, their bells marking the hours of labor and prayer. Across Siberia, explorers mapped rivers, built forts, and brought orthodox crosses to distant tribes. The empire grew not only in power, but in memory, each expansion leaving stories, songs, and traditions stitched into the fabric of the people. As you pause here, picture the empire at the end of the 18th century, St. Petersburg shining on the Neva, its palaces mirrored in water, Moscow older and more traditional, its domes golden under the sun. Villages scattered across plains and forests. Peasants in felt boots trudging through snow. Cossacks riding across the steppe. And far to the east, rivers flowing through silent taiga. It is a realm vast beyond measure, both magnificent and fragile, bound by faith, ruled by autocrats, carried forward by the endurance of millions. This is Imperial Russia, radiant in its ambition, haunted by its contradictions, moving steadily toward the storms of the centuries to come. The dawn of the 19th century found Russia vast and confident. Its banners spread from the frozen Baltic to the shores of the Black Sea, from the steppes of Ukraine to the rivers of Siberia. The palaces of St. Petersburg glittered with candlelight and music, while in the villages, peasants still bent over fields as their ancestors had done for centuries. Yet, the century would test the empire with fire and change, bringing both suffering and brilliance, both despair and glory. The first great trial came with Napoleon. In 1812, the French emperor, master of Europe, turned his gaze eastward and led a mighty army into Russia. Imagine the summer roads filled with marching columns, drums and trumpets echoing, banners snapping in the wind. His army, the Granda, numbered over 500,000, the largest Europe had ever seen. Against it, Russia's armies fell back, retreating deeper into the land, burning fields and villages to deny the enemy food. The peasants watched their homes consumed by flames, yet in their sacrifice lay a strategy. The land itself would fight. The vastness of Russia would become a weapon. The decisive moment came at Borodino, west of Moscow. In September 1812, the fields filled with smoke. The thunder of cannon rolled, and soldiers clashed in desperate fury. It was a day of slaughter, tens of thousands falling, yet no side emerged clearly victorious. The Russians retreated, leaving Moscow open, and Napoleon entered the city. But Moscow burned. Flames rose from wooden houses, smoke darkened the sky, and the French found themselves in a ruined shell. Winter approached, food dwindled, and the retreat began. Through snow and hunger, across frozen rivers, the Grande disintegrated, harried by Cossacks, stalked by frost. Of the 500,000 who entered, only a fraction escaped. Russia had not only survived, it had humbled the mightiest conqueror of Europe. In memory, the War of 1812 became sacred, retold in song and story, immortalized in Tolstoy's War and Peace, a hymn to endurance and sacrifice. The victory stirred pride, yet it also awakened voices for change. Soldiers returning from campaigns in Europe had seen different worlds, parliaments, rights, freedoms. They came back to a land where millions were still serfs, bound to their lords, unable to leave the soil. In 1825, on the death of Tsar Alexander I, a group of officers staged the Decembrist revolt in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution and an end to autocracy. They stood in snow on Senate Square, banners raised, calling for liberty. The uprising was swiftly crushed, leaders executed or exiled to Siberia, but their memory lingered. They became martyrs in the Russian imagination, seeds of revolution planted long before their time. Under Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855, Russia became a fortress of conservatism. He strengthened censorship, expanded the secret police, and declared his doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Beneath this rigid order, unrest smoldered. Serfdom weighed heavily. Peasants tied to landowners as if in chains. Their labor sustaining noble estates, their lives burdened by taxes and duties. The empire seemed strong, but its foundations were brittle. Its grandeur built upon inequality and silence. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 exposed these weaknesses. Russia fought against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, and though its soldiers fought bravely, the empire's outdated weapons and poor logistics brought defeat. The war revealed that Russia, for all its size, lagged behind the modern powers. The shock led to the great reforms of Alexander II, who came to be known as the Tsar Liberator. In 1861, he issued the Emancipation Edict, freeing more than 20 million serfs. It was one of the largest acts of liberation in history, a thunderclap that reshaped society. Yet, freedom was incomplete. Peasants received little land and remained bound by debts. Still, it marked a turning point, a step from bondage toward possibility. Alongside reform came a flowering of culture. The 19th century became Russia's golden age of literature and music. A century when words and melodies captured the soul of the nation. Alexander Pushkin, poet of fire and clarity, gave voice to Russian language itself, making it sing with elegance and power. His verses, romantic and tragic, became beloved across all classes, read by nobles in salons and whispered by peasants in villages. After him came giants. Nikolai Gogol, with his tales of haunted clerks and grotesque laughter. Fyodor Dostoevsky, exploring the depths of guilt, redemption, and the torment of the human soul. Leo Tolstoy, painting vast landscapes of war and peace, of families and eternity. Anton Chekhov, with plays and stories of quiet sorrow and fragile hope. Their words became the mirrors of Russian life, reflecting suffering, faith, despair, and resilience. Music, too, blossomed. Tear-highest, Tchaikovsky composed ballets and symphonies that echoed with both sorrow and beauty. The Nutcracker and Swan Lake shimmering like dreamscapes, his symphonies filled with the ache of longing. The mighty handful, Mussorgsky, Rimsky, Korsakov, Borodin, Kui, wove folk melodies into orchestral grandeur, filling concert halls with the voice of the land itself. In their works, one hears both the vast steppes and the intimate sadness of Russian life, a harmony of grandeur and melancholy. Meanwhile, science and thought advanced. Universities expanded. Intellectuals debated reform. Radicals whispered of revolution. Railroads spread across the empire, linking cities, carrying goods and people, shrinking the vast distances. Industry grew in Moscow and St. Petersburg, drawing peasants into factories, changing rhythms of life. Yet alongside progress, inequality remained sharp. The nobility still held privilege, the peasants still bore burdens, and voices of dissent grew louder. By the end of the century, discontent surged. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 by revolutionaries shocked the empire, plunging it into repression under Alexander III. Yet the idea of change could not be extinguished. Marxist thought spread, workers struck, peasants protested, and intellectuals formed secret societies. The empire seemed immense, eternal, but beneath the golden domes and palaces, the ground trembled with unrest. As you picture Russia in the 19th century, see both grandeur and hardship. Moscow streets alive with merchants and bells. St. Petersburg's palaces glowing with music and poetry, peasants trudging through snowbound fields, factory chimneys rising in haze, students reading forbidden books by candlelight. It is a land of contrasts, autocracy and rebellion, bondage and liberation, sorrow and song. Out of these contradictions, Russia moved toward a new century, one that would bring revolution, upheaval, and a transformation more radical than any before. The turn of the 20th century found Russia immense, yet fragile. Stretched across 11 time zones, home to peasants, nobles, workers, merchants, nomads, and scholars. Beneath the glitter of St. Petersburg's palaces, cracks widened. Factories belched smoke. Workers lived in crowded tenements. Peasants remained tied to poverty despite emancipation, and dissent smoldered in every corner. The empire of the Romanovs, 300 years old, stood like a colossus, yet its feet were clay. The first tremor came in 1905. In January, a peaceful procession of workers marched toward the Winter Palace, carrying icons and petitions, hoping to present their pleas to Tsar Nicholas II. They asked for better wages, shorter hours, and dignity in their lives. Instead, soldiers opened fire. Hundreds fell in the snow, their cries echoing against palace walls. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and the shock spread like wildfire. Strikes erupted, railways stopped, peasants rose against landlords, mutinies broke out on ships. The empire trembled on the edge of collapse. Though Nicholas conceded a parliament, the Duma, real power, remained in his hands, and discontent simmered on. The revolution of 1905 had not destroyed the monarchy, but it had cracked its aura forever. Then came 1914, the guns of Europe, the First World War. Russia entered with pride, its soldiers marching to the front with icons and songs. But the war bled the empire dry. Millions died in trenches, railways faltered, bread ran short in cities. In villages, families waited for sons who never returned. In factories, workers starved as they labored. The Tsar left the capital to command the army, leaving government in the hands of ministers dominated by whispers of Rasputin, the mystic healer whose presence at court scandalized the nation. By 1917, hunger and despair broke into rage. In February, workers in Petrograd, once St. Petersburg, struck. Women marched for bread. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. The Tsar abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in a single week of protest. The empire was gone. Yet abdication did not bring peace. A provisional government formed, promising reform. But it struggled to control the streets and to end the war. Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, rose with their own authority, demanding power for the people. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized their moment. With cries of peace, land, and bread, they stormed the Winter Palace, overthrew the government, and declared a new order. The red banners of revolution rose over Russia, and the Soviet Union began its long and turbulent journey. Civil war followed, fierce and merciless. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, fought against the Whites, a coalition of monarchists, liberals, and foreign armies who sought to crush the revolution. Villages burned, trains carried armies across endless steppes. Famine stalked the land. The war was brutal, but the Bolsheviks endured. By 1922, the Red Army triumphed, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was proclaimed. The old empire was gone. In its place stood the world's first communist state. In the 1920s, Lenin sought to rebuild. Factories reopened. Literacy campaigns spread. New art flourished. Avant-garde painters and poets imagined a new society of equality and progress. Yet, beneath the optimism lay tension. For Lenin's health failed, and his successor would take the revolution in a darker direction. Joseph Stalin rose to power in the 1930s, a man of steel in name and in rule. He launched the 5-year plans, forcing rapid industrialization. Fields were collectivized, peasants driven into state farms, millions suffering in the process. Famine struck Ukraine in the Holodomor, where hunger claimed countless lives. Cities grew with smokestacks and factories, but the price was unbearable suffering. Stalin's rule was marked not only by industry, but by fear. Purges swept the land. Show trials condemned old revolutionaries. Secret police filled prisons and camps. The Gulag archipelago stretched across Siberia, where millions labored in cold and silence, building canals, mines, and railways. Families lived in dread of a midnight knock at the door. Yet, at the same time, propaganda filled streets with images of progress. Tractors in fields. New schools, parades of workers marching with banners. The Soviet people endured, caught between terror and pride, hardship and hope. Then came the greatest trial of all, the Second World War, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded with Operation Barbarossa, unleashing the largest assault in history. Tanks rolled across the plains. Planes roared in the skies. Villages fell in flames. At first, disaster struck. Millions captured. Cities besieged. Moscow threatened. But the Soviet people rallied. Factories moved east, beyond the Urals, producing weapons day and night. Soldiers fought in fields, in forests, in the ruins of cities. At Stalingrad, the battle turned. Amid ruins and blood, the Red Army encircled the enemy and won a victory that became legend. From there, the Soviets pushed westward, step by step, until Berlin fell in 1945. The cost was immense. Over 20 million Soviet lives lost, entire cities destroyed. Yet, the victory was absolute. The Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag, and Russia stood among the victors, scarred but triumphant. After the war, the USSR emerged as a superpower. Stalin's iron grip continued, rebuilding the land, expanding influence across Eastern Europe. The Cold War began, a long struggle of ideology and power with the United States. Nuclear weapons, espionage, propaganda. The world lived in the shadow of confrontation. Inside the Soviet Union, life was harsh, yet filled with contrasts. Apartments in towering blocks housed families. Ration lines tested patience. But schools taught literacy and science. Theaters staged ballets. Libraries spread knowledge. Children played in courtyards while cosmonauts prepared for space. In 1957, Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, soared into orbit. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. "I see Earth," he said, gazing down from the stars. His words echoed with pride, a moment when the Soviet dream seemed boundless. Yet beneath the achievements, shortages and repression remained. Dissidents whispered their truths in some Izdat manuscripts, secretly copied and passed hand to hand. The gulags still swallowed the defiant. The dream of equality flickered, but reality was harder. Stalin's death in 1953 opened new paths. Under Nikita Khrushchev came a thaw. Censorship eased, prisoners freed, the crimes of the past denounced. But the Cold War still tightened its grip. From Berlin to Cuba, each crisis shaking the world. Later, leaders Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko presided over stagnation. Factories slowed, shops emptied, and hope dulled. Yet even in these gray years, culture endured. Poets recited verses in kitchens. Musicians filled halls. Filmmakers whispered truth through allegory. The people endured, as they always had, through silence and resilience. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union stood immense but weary, its power vast, its people restless. Change was coming, and with it, the next turning point of history. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union seemed both eternal and exhausted. On maps, it stretched like a continent, red across Eurasia, commanding half of Europe and influencing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Its military was vast, its nuclear arsenal immense, its achievements in space and science unmatched. Yet, beneath the banners of power, daily life told another story. Factories produced in quantity, but not in quality. Stores offered long lines and empty shelves. Corruption crept through the system, and faith in the future dimmed. The people endured as they always had, with patience and humor, but whispers of change stirred in the air. Life in late Soviet times was marked by contrasts. In cities, gray apartment blocks, Khrushchevkas, rose in endless rows, their walls thin. Their rooms small, yet they gave millions their first private space after generations in communal dwellings. In kitchens, families gathered around samovars, boiling tea while discussing politics in hushed tones. Libraries were filled with eager readers, for books were both treasure and refuge. Schools taught science with rigor, and every child knew the names of cosmonauts and poets. On weekends, families strolled through parks, children clutching balloons, while elderly men played chess on benches. It was a life of quiet rhythms, of endurance shaped by scarcity and hope. The Soviet people took pride in their victories, even as they sighed at their shortages. Internationally, the Cold War framed every gesture. The Soviet Union and the United States competed for dominance not only in arms, but in space, in ideology, in influence across the globe. In Africa and Asia, revolutions bore Soviet advisors. In Latin America, the Red Star glimmered in banners. Yet at home, the dream of communism felt distant, weighed down by bureaucracy. Dissidents risked exile or prison to speak truth. Poets like Joseph Brodsky, novelists like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, voices of conscience, revealed the gulag and the silence behind the facade. Underground art, Samistic literature, and whispered music carried a quiet rebellion that no police could fully erase. The 1980s brought a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, young, energetic, different from the gray faces before him. He sought reform. He spoke of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Censorship loosened, debates flourished, newspapers printed truths once hidden. Citizens, long accustomed to silence, found themselves suddenly able to speak, to question, to hope. Factories were reformed, cooperatives allowed, markets tentatively opened. Yet, with openness came revelation. Corruption, inefficiency, the scale of repression in the past. The very truths that were meant to heal also weakened faith in the system. Abroad, Gorbachev pursued, reaching treaties with the United States to limit nuclear arms. In Eastern Europe, Soviet control loosened. In 1989, one by one, communist governments fell. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. Crowds tore down the Berlin Wall, and the world changed in days. Soviet tanks did not roll to stop it. Gorbachev let history move. The empire of influence crumbled, and with it, the illusion of permanence. At home, the late 1980s became a storm. Nationalities, long bound in silence, demanded independence. Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Ukrainians. Strikes paralyzed factories, shelves grew emptier, inflation soared. In August 1991, hardline communists staged a coup in Moscow, tanks rolling into the city to preserve the old order. Yet, the people resisted. Crowds gathered, led by Boris Yeltsin, who stood upon a tank outside the Russian parliament, calling for courage. The coup failed, but the Soviet Union was mortally wounded. By December 1991, it ceased to exist. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor of Russia. The Soviet Union, born in revolution, ended not in fire, but in silence. 70 years of history vanished in a single moment. For the people, the collapse was both liberation and uncertainty. Some rejoiced in freedom, others mourned the loss of stability. Borders shifted, republics became nations, and Russia itself entered a new age. The Cold War, which had shaped decades of life, was suddenly over, and the future was unwritten. Picture Russia in those final days of the Soviet Union. Families huddled around televisions as news of the coup unfolded. Lines stretching outside stores with little to buy. Banners of independence raised in Baltic capitals. And in Moscow, the red Soviet flag lowered against the winter sky. It was an ending and a beginning, a moment of profound change, carried out not with guns and fire, but with weariness and resolve. The Soviet era, with all its triumphs and terrors, had passed into memory, leaving Russia to walk into the uncharted landscape of a new world. When the red flag came down from the Kremlin in December 1991, silence filled the air. For the first time in 7 decades, the Soviet Union was no more. In its place stood 15 new nations, their borders drawn from the map of republics that had once been bound together by ideology and force. Russia itself, the largest of them, carrying the legacy of empire and revolution alike, now faced a future uncharted. The tricolor of white, blue, and red flew once more, an echo of centuries past. Yet beneath it, the land was shaken, uncertain, fragile. The 1990s were years of hardship and transition. The Soviet system had collapsed suddenly, and with it, the old guarantees of life: work, housing, pensions, stability. A new market economy was born in chaos. State industries were privatized, fortunes amassed by a few, and ordinary people struggled. Inflation devoured savings. Shelves, once bare, now overflowed with imported goods, yet few could afford them. In cities, kiosks sprouted on sidewalks, selling everything from chewing gum to electronics. In villages, people bartered potatoes, firewood, and tools. Crime rose, gangs battled in the streets, and the word oligarch entered daily speech. Men who seized industries, wealth, and influence overnight. It was a time of freedom, but also of fear. Daily life changed in countless ways. Western music, films, and fashions flooded into Russia. Billboards advertised jeans and soda, symbols of a world once kept at bay. Young people embraced new styles, while older generations sighed for the stability of the past. The Soviet dream had ended, but what replaced it was not yet clear. Some felt exhilaration at the openness, others disorientation. Yet poverty lingered, and uncertainty weighed heavily. In politics, Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, steered the nation through stormy waters. He sought democracy, markets, and integration with the world, but his years were marked by struggle. In 1993, a confrontation between parliament and president ended in tanks firing on the White House in Moscow. In Chechnya, war erupted, brutal and bloody, leaving scars that burned for years. Yet, through it all, Russia endured, searching for its identity in a changed world. Culturally, the 1990s were also years of rebirth. Writers, long silenced, spoke freely. Artists experimented, filmmakers explored, musicians blended rock, folk, and new styles. filled with arguments about politics and poetry. Television blossomed with variety. Newspapers shouted with voices once censored. The chaos of the age was reflected in its creativity, raw and restless, alive with energy. It was as if the lid had been lifted, and all that had been held back poured out at once. Confusion and brilliance intertwined. By the turn of the millennium, Russia had changed again. In 2000, Vladimir Putin became president, promising order after years of turmoil. Under his rule, stability returned for many. The economy strengthened with rising oil and gas prices. Cities grew wealthier, and wages rose. Moscow became a city of glittering lights, new towers, and crowded boulevards. Yet, the order came with tightening control. Media grew less free, dissent more dangerous, power more centralized. For some, it was a welcome return to strength. For others, a shadow over the fragile shoots of democracy. It embraced global markets, hosted world events, launched spacecraft, and nurtured culture. At the same time, it carried old burdens: inequality, corruption, unrest. Its identity remained shaped by contradictions, openness and control, pride and loss, tradition and change. In villages, life still followed ancient rhythms: fields plowed, festivals held, bells rung. In cities, neon lights and smartphones filled the streets, and young voices dreamed of futures far beyond the past. Russia was modern, yet still deeply old. And through it all, memory lingered. The Mongol yoke, the rise of Moscow, the glory of Kiev, the brilliance of Peter and Catherine, the suffering of serfs, the triumph of 1812, the tragedy of revolutions, the iron grip of Stalin, the fire of war, the silence of the Gulag, the hope of Gagarin, the collapse of an empire. All these moments lived within the soul of the people. Russia carried its past not as a burden alone, but as a deep current, a river flowing beneath the surface of daily life. Picture Russia today, Moscow's skyline shimmering with glass towers beside the red walls of the Kremlin, St. Petersburg's canals gleaming under white nights, villages tucked in forests, smoke rising from chimneys, children walking to school with backpacks, elderly women crossing themselves before icons, students in debating art and politics. It is a land where history never sleeps, where every stone, every field, every river carries memory. The Russia of today is not the Rus of Kiev, nor the empire of Tsars, nor the Soviet Union. Yet, all of these still whisper within it. A land eternal, vast, resilient, always changing, always enduring. And so, the story of Russia comes to rest. A story not of one age, but of many, layered like rings of an ancient tree. From the forests of the early Slavs to the golden domes of Kiev, from the silence of Mongol nights to the rising bells of Moscow, from the fire of empire to the storms of revolution, from the triumphs and terrors of the fragile balance of the present, the land has endured. It has endured snow and famine, invasion and upheaval, change and rebirth. Always enduring, always vast, always alive with memory. Now, as you let the echoes fade, imagine the forests once more, birch and pine swaying in a quiet wind, rivers flowing endlessly, snow falling gently over villages and fields. The bells are distant, the voices of centuries softened, the weight of history becoming only a lullaby. You are safe, the night is calm, and the long story of Russia settles like a blanket around you. Rest now, as the land itself rests beneath its stars.